Hi, my name is Steven and I made a page on YouTube, Kirby Woodworking, around a year ago, and this is going to be my 20th video to date. So I decided to make this the most epic project by combining everything I've done over the past 19 videos. This is going to have live edge, epoxy, wood carving, and wood bending in this one-of-a-kind epic project. To get this project started, I'm going to be making a template for the Epoxy Pour, which will in the end be the template for the table. I'm going to be getting a piece of fiberglass and installing a pivot point on one end and the router to approximately 22 inches away so that I can make the circular table a total of 44 inches in diameter. So we're going to do a rough cut. I'm going to flip it over and use a top guided bearing for the router bit, and I'm going to be tracing this exact template onto the piece of wood. Now we're going to have a perfect template for the formwork behind, where we can just easily wrap it up, and we'll also have the Manitoba maple in place where we can do the epoxy pour around to have a perfectly finished circle at the end. Try to remember what this log looked like when we started the project. Now, we milled this log up ourselves. We got it from a place that was going to use it as firewood. So right now it's been curing in the shop for around 2 years. After taking a quick pass through on the stroke sander, you can start to see the grains pop, and by the end of the project you can really see the grains and the color come through. Now these pieces are too big to fit through my standard planer, so I had to use my planing jig. Now this is going to flatten the one side that will be resting against the formwork that I created earlier. I want to make sure there's a tight seal between there so I don't lose any epoxy, as epoxy is running between $30 to $40 a liter. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm using my circular formwork as a template. So on the router, I have a top guided flush bearing bit, and I'm going to be tracing this over my rough cut Manitoba maple to make sure it's perfect. I'm just taking one final pass through on the sander just in case I see any burrs or jaggedy edges that came from the router. Now just remember, before you do any epoxy pour, make sure that you put a bond breaker between the epoxy and the formwork underneath. Otherwise it's going to fasten harder than glue. So now when I strip the wood off of this form, it'll peel the tape off rather than damage the wood. Once the forms are done, make sure you take a couple passes through with the silicone to seal up any joints. Now that everything's fastened down, you're going to see a couple of steps in my epoxy pour process. I'm going to pre-mix everything in the large container, which is the overall takeoff of epoxy that I need. And then you see this orange container with the lid around that I'm placing the smaller sections into. That's actually a vacuum chamber, and I'm trying to remove as much of the micro bubbles as I can before I pour it into the epoxy. In addition, I'm going to be taking a heat gun and taking passes through there to make sure I pop any surface bubbles that arise. Now I'm going to do a final check with the elevations, make sure that this form didn't move and that everything's flat so that the epoxy cures evenly. After you give the epoxy 3 days to cure, you're ready to start to strip the formwork. So you can see how difficult it is to remove the exterior even with the tape as a bond breaker. It does take quite a while. Now for the underside, even with the tape, it is difficult. So I had to get shims to use as wedges, and I had to go around the table very gradually. I don't want to be too rash with how quickly I rip this off. I don't want any damage to happen to the table. Similar to before, I'm going to use my custom router planing bit, as this is way too big to fit through my planer. I'm then going to take a 30 grit sandpaper pass through everything to get rid of the rough lines. Now this isn't going to be the finished product, but it does give me a smooth surface that I can begin to work on. I'm going to be using the top guided flush router bit once again, and that's just to get any deviations I had in the epoxy forming up against the side. A couple little parts where it's going in or out, and this just cleans everything up so it's perfectly flat. For the top, I was going for a modern look, so I decided to go with a 45-degree chamfer across the entire surface. Because I want this epoxy to be see-through, I'm going to be sanding this table all the way up to 3000 grit. Make sure you do every single grit on the way up, whatever your department store makes available. For my epoxy projects, I use OSMO oil wax. On the underside, I'm going to be placing 2 coats. On the top, I will be placing 4 coats. So after I put a coat of OSMO oil across the entire table, I'm going to leave it there for approximately 15 minutes before I use my buffing wheel. So this buffing wheel, I just put a cloth on top of there, and you leave the OSMO on there for 15 minutes to allow it to harden, and you're going to realize it turns into somewhat of a pasty wax. By using the buffing wheel afterwards, you're going to be able to take the excess off. It's also oscillating, so you're going to get a smooth finish across the entire surface. If you do this work by hand, you're going to realize you have a lot of streaks in there because you can't evenly apply the pressure as well as a foam pad oscillating brush. So now I'm done with the tabletop. I'm going to show you how I made the solid base, middle section, and the outriggers on the bottom. I wanted the base to be a solid piece of wood, so the largest size I could get for thickness was 3 inches. So after I put it through the planer, I'm going to cut it in the desired length, and I'm going to complete a glue up between the two so I can have a 6-inch thickness along with the 6-inch width that I initially had. The central block is now complete. I'm going to take the remaining curly maple I have, and I'm going to be cutting 45-degree chamfers on the chop saw. These are going to be the outriggers that you see on top. I'm going to drill pilot holes through these 45-degree chamfers. Now, when I do the glue up between these pieces and the block, I need to have compression in there for the glue before it sets. These screws will only be temporary. Once the glue sets, I will remove the screws and put a larger drill bit through there, and then put a solid maple dowel in between the two. For the purposes of making sure that there are no gaps while I'm doing the glue up, the screws were a quicker and easier option that I can easily remove later. So now my blank template is complete for the upper portion. I'm going to start to work on the bottom portion. Now for this, I also have a curly piece of maple, but this has a lot more texture than the other piece, which is why I wanted to have it on the bottom. Now, before I do this, I don't want a solid piece to carve off of. I'm actually going to cut the rough shape of what I want to accomplish before I start to do the carving process. So for the two table base sections, I'm going to cut out the dado of the reverse. So just a quick visual of that. This is how the first section will look. And then the other section, I'm going to cut the bottom portion out so that the two will slide into each other, and I can insert a dowel to hold it all into place. I'm going to be salvaging this piece of wood. You see these streaks coming through here? So this is the tiger maple look. And right now, on the bottom of this piece, I don't have a tiger maple look because it's in the core of the tree. So I'm going to cut this piece in half and I'm going to glue it on both sides. And it's going to act as a thick veneer so I can get that nice finish on the exterior. I can also wind this out, and when I do my power carving, I'm going to shape this so it all looks seamless into one another. So now I have my blank canvas. I'm going to be taking it over and start the carving. Now, to make sure that this is as symmetrical as I can possibly make it by freehanding it, as you can see, I'm going to take it and take minor cuts and slowly rotate and mimic that cut on every identical piece. This is a slow and tedious process where I didn't want to gouge out too much material. I want to make slow and gradual cuts and then keep an eye on each individual piece to make sure that they were matching each other. This portion is just a quick tidy up. There was a couple of extra outriggers on the bottom that I didn't enjoy, so I cut it first with the bandsaw, and then I'm going to take it over to the router table after I cut it and remove the excess so that it's flush with that curvature I cut earlier. Now I know I quickened this up quite a bit, however this is a very long process. To carve everything that you saw in the past couple of minutes, it took me 3 days for the base and then the top. This is a very slow and tedious process, and every single time I make a mistake, I find myself adding a couple more hours onto my duration. Okay, so now we got the pencil lines on top of the piece, so I'm going to be using 150 grit, and remember, I'm going to do this in every step to make sure there's no inconsistencies in how I sand. Okay, so now I'm done with the central support system. I'm going to start to make these curved pieces. I'm going to be combining a steel grating, and I'll show you how I bent this wood for the forms. So I'm going to be using a bending process, and I'm going to put this metal grate, which is just steel that I painted with a bronze oil rub finish, and I'm going to be inserting this into the steel and then capping it off with this piece of wood. Now you have to make sure that you cut it down to a 3/16 thickness in order to bend it properly before you fit it into the forms. You're going to see how I do that in the next couple of minutes. The shop's pretty nice. If you go digging for long enough, you can find the wood that you're looking for. I think these pieces of maple have been in my dad's shop for around 15 years. centimeters, and they were the perfect size and dimension that I could use them for the piece that you saw earlier. So right now I'm going to cut them into 1/4 inch strips, and I'm going to take them over to the planer to make them all consistently 3/16 of an inch. As I mentioned earlier, to properly bend this wood without it cracking, 3/16 is the money spot. We're going to get a glue layer in between each of these pieces that we cut earlier, and we're going to put it in this form. Now the form, I'm just going to put a clamp on it, I'm going to squeeze them together, and then once the glue dries, I can break them all apart. And you can see I just made a form, and I just put 3 pieces of 1/4 inch maple in there, and I put a glue layer in between all of them, so when I take it out of the form, it's going to hold that shape. This router has an inset cutter in it, so I'm able to put a dado inside of those curved pieces. Once I'm done that, I can now slide that steel grating directly into the wood and then clamp it within. Now the steel just had to be close. I'm going to be using the pieces of wood as a form so that it doesn't have too much tension in it, but the closer I get it, the less tension I have and the less clamps I need. Or so I thought. This was a pretty stressful glue up to get each piece in. I had to start off individually with each grate. I could not clamp both of them at the same time. There was just too much tension inside of that steel. So I started on one side, and you can see how many clamps I have to use to make sure that this will hold this rigid shape. Once it sets, I can remove all of these clamps, and I just mimic that exact same process on the other side. When clamping these up, there was so much stress on them, I just felt more comfortable if I put a nail on the back end. Now the back end, you don't see any of it, but I still want to make sure that I patch it with a putty before I put my pencil lines across the entire face, and similar to my process earlier, I sand every single grit for wood between 60 to 220. Now I have the individual segments of the base complete. I just need to begin to assemble everything. So between those 2 bases you see in the video, I'm going to be using 5 dowels in total, 1 large and 4 small, to make sure that there's no separation in the future. So the dowels look difficult, but they're a pretty easy process. You're just going to drill a hole, and you have these inserts that go in, and they have a prick on top. So now that I'm using a brad point on the end of my drill, that point is going to perfectly slide in with this point, so I can get a perfect transition between this piece and this piece afterwards. Whenever you do a glue up, you'll find that it didn't match and fit perfectly as it did before, and I'm talking 1 or 2 millimeter difference. I just take a quick pass through and just mend the 2 pieces together so the transition is seamless. So for the adjustable feet, I'm actually going to countersink into the bottom of the table so that they will be hidden except for the felt pad. What you're currently watching was not done on purpose. It's probably one of the biggest mistakes I have made in my recent memory. Ugh. I screwed up. Okay, so on this piece over here, I have a crack right now. That's separated here. You can see that in the past video. And really my screw up is not planning far enough ahead with regards to fastening this piece to this piece in here. I thought that the loading would come straight from the top, so I wouldn't have any separation, but that was pretty clear. If I have awkward pressure and I push down on this end, a crack came here. So we got away with a minor mistake that will get covered up by the metal grating. But I'm gonna put some dowels in here now to put some reinforcement, and it's just gonna be a glue face on both sides that hold everything together. Now to attach the top of the table base to the underside of the table, I'm going to be installing 3/16 dowels. These are just wooden dowels. So I'm going to be tracing on these dowels from the table base onto the tabletop, and it's just going to slide into one another. Okay, so now's the tricky step. I have to conjoin the curved pieces to my table base. This is pretty risky. I'm gonna take a lot of small steps, a lot of small cuts, and I'm gonna just slowly start to mend the two pieces together. There will be a small gap that I'm gonna have to use a patch with, but we'll deal with that when we get to the point where I think it's acceptable. Now before I do the final product, I'm going to do a dry fit, and I'm going to use this opportunity to shape that curvature piece into the table base below. Now permanently I'm going to be having screws along with glue holding this together. However, for this application, just screws will do. Now I'm going to disassemble everything, and I'm going to be placing a layer of painter's tape on top of everywhere I do not want the lacquer finish to touch. Now, the reason for the tape, if I were to assemble this entire piece together and then I were to try to finish the lacquer across the entire span, I wouldn't be able to get a consistent coat because there would be a lot of crevices in between. I couldn't get the gun in there. So now, once I'm done placing the coats individually on each section, I'll take off the pieces of tape, put some carpenter's glue in between so that it has proper adhesion and it has a solid bond with no inconsistencies in the finish. The first step in the finishing process is to use a sealer to expose any inconsistencies along with raise any loose fibers. Okay, so I just put the sealer coat on it. After the sealer coat is applied, you're gonna have to get a 320 grit sandpaper and you're gonna have to scratch the entire surfaces. Any loose fibers on the wood after you place the sealer will stand up and it's gonna be somewhat of a prickly surface, so take a quick pass through before you put on your lacquer finish. So now I'm done with the sanding. I'm going to be putting the lacquer finish on there. I'm going to be using a 40% gloss finish. So I'm going to have 2 cups of the 40% gloss. I'm going to have 1/3 of a cup of catalyzer. That's going to help it to set quicker. And I'm going to be using 1/2 of a cup of lacquer thinner, and that's going to help it go through the spray nozzle so it doesn't get clumped up inside. For these pieces, I used a total of 5 coats of the 40% lacquer finish. In between each coat, I'm going to let it sit for approximately 5 to 6 minutes before I spray the next coat. I want the previous coat to be tacky, not wet, not dry, so that I can get proper adhesion to the next coat that I put on top of that. Now I'm going to remove the tape and I'm going to begin the assembly, and I'm going to install those 2 screws, and I'm going to later plug them up with those little maple dowels I was mentioning earlier. Once the glue sets, I'm just going to quickly remove the excess dowels that are protruding from the piece. Okay, so now that I've combined the 2 pieces and I put the plugs in to conceal the screw holes, I'm going to have to take it over and do one final coat with the spray. Now I still need to make sure that I support that top curvature section. You can see it's just freehanding there. So these pieces I'm carving right now will act as brackets on the underside of the table, and they will be fastened to the top of that curvature section. So I've created these outrigger pieces to hold the side-to-side movement for these curved pieces. This is architectural, it doesn't actually hold any weight, and I just want to make sure that when you hit it from the side, it won't snap and break on me. Before I can call this a finished product, I have to do one final dry fit between the table base and the tabletop using the dowels I drilled out earlier. So I'm not going to do any final fastening right now. This is all just a dry fit. This is too wide to fit through my front door, so after I take it apart, I'll take it into my house individually and I'm going to reassemble it there. Now you can see why I pre-drilled those holes earlier in the legs. I'm going to be placing some screws to fasten the base to the top. Once I am done with that, I'm going to use the OSMO cleaner and I'm going to rub it down once so that everything is crystal clear. So if you made it through the entire 30 minutes, thank you for watching. If you did enjoy, be sure to put a like and put a comment in the description on what you want a 21st, 22nd, maybe or 23rd project to be. In the meantime, if you don't mind, please subscribe and hit that alert button to see any notifications of new projects coming up.